Hi, I'm Bill Fawcett, and we're doing an interview with S.M.Stirling, Steve Stirling, for Ring of Fire Con. Hi, Steve.
Hi, Bill. Good to actually see a human face again, even if vicariously.
Welcome to Ring of Fire Con, our virtual Ring of Fire Con this year. And I suppose S.M. Stirling, of course, is the famous author of the Change series, the Black Chamber series, and a lot of other different books that we'll discuss today. Does a lot of alternate history in varying ways, not all of which are standard alternate history. In one series that if you're a Ring of Fire fan and you're not aware of, you probably should be, because it's got some fun similarities and it's a fun read. So we will chat then. It's called Island in the Seas of Time series. All right, Steve, let's start with with what you were just saying. How is the lockdown affecting you?
Well, I'm working out a lot more. And the rest of the time, I do what I do anyway, which is write. It's my hobby as well as my living. So I actually got fired or quit from virtually every other job I ever had. So I'm fortunate I was able to make a living on this.
Okay, that's good. Psychologically, is anything in your writing being reflected by this worldwide situation?
Not really, as far as I can see. I've been working from home since 1988, so that doesn't change. And most of the things I do, I can do at home. What I really miss is coffee shops and restaurants, which I have several in town, which don't mind me grimacing and muttering to myself as I work. And, I was using those a lot, mainly to escape from my extremely emotionally needy cat. So apart from that, no. The fact that you can't travel is irritating, because I do like traveling. For the audience, Bill and Jody and Jan and I were going to go to Egypt this spring, which was obvious.
That didn't work out.
It didn't work out, let's put it that way. In fact, we were going on a Nile boat, and the first large case of COVID-19 transmission in Egypt was on a Nile boat among a bunch of tourists. So when it's safe. I want to see the temples, but I'm not prepared to die for it, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, definitely. After all the pharaohs already did.
Mm-hmm. We don't even get mummified.
It gets hot if we go in the summer. Yeah. All right. Yeah. How much? Well, speaking of travel, just because you brought that up, you've traveled a good deal, both as a child and since you've grown. What of your books are reflected in the travel? Which travel inspired what books, if any?
Well, my dad was RCAF, Royal Canadian Air Force, and I was born in France because he was stationed there. And we moved all over every couple of years. And then he was in the Canadian Foreign Aid Department, and we moved all over because of that. I spent most of my teenage years in Nairobi in Kenya, and we traveled over Africa in our spare time. That affected a couple of my early series. I've always been interested in African history. African history is interesting. That doesn't mean it's fun for the people involved. One person our family knew, a friend of the family, was taken away by Idi Amin's secret police to be shot and fed to the crocodiles, which Idi called his rafikis, which means his buddies. But he jimmied the lock on the inside of the car trunk they'd stuffed him into and walked 250 miles to the Kenyan border. And there was a famine while I was living in Kenya, and I stepped over dead and dying bodies on the way to school. You might say it gave me a different perspective than your average upper middle class North American kid. So that's influenced me. Just traveling gets you out of your shell and makes you realize that you and your social reference group are not all that representative of humanity as a whole. So does reading history if you do it right. That's my other great love. I wanted to be a history professor with a tweed jacket and leather patches on my elbows and a pipe, and I don't even smoke. But I realized after looking into it while I was in university how long it takes to get to be that professor and what the odds are, and I decided that even writing fiction was a better bet. And I wanted to write fiction since I was about 6 when I was convinced I was Ming the Merciless. So
Ming the Merciless?
they played those old Buck Rogers serials
Flash
in
Gordon.
the summer.
Flash Gordon,
And-
Shaky Spaceship series.
Yeah,
With
and
Buster Graham.
yeah, at the school I went to, they played them in the summer, and I saw them all. I've always liked a good villain, if you know what I mean. I'm told I do good villain. You know,
Well,
just get down with your bad self.
all right. Well, let's talk about some of your writings, and a lot of it's alternate history, which is what Ring of Fire Con's main theme. And let's go way back to the books I met you over and chastise you for the ending of many, many decades ago at this point.
Oh, you and Jim.
The Dracus series, which you wrote. It's set initially in Africa, in fact. What is the Dracus Theory? Tell the readers who haven't read it yet, because it's a good alternate universe.
It's an alternate history. The change point is like, I'm proud of how obscure it is. It's the date at which the Dutch entered the War of the American Revolution. It's a little earlier in my alternate history, and as a result, the British seized the Cape, and then after the American Revolution goes more or less the way it did in our history, a lot of the loyalists go there, and eventually they become a superpower and more or less conquer the world. I wanted a setting. Well, I wanted to do just actually, to stretch myself technically, I wanted to do a bad guys win series, and that seemed to me to be the best setting for something bad to incubate off everyone's radar until it was too late. And I also wanted to do a bad guys win series where the bad guys weren't too close an XP of some historical villain. Yes, I remember coming into contact with some people who were writing fan fiction about the Dracula books, and I had an abbreviation that I used with them, NNG, not Nazi Germany, because they kept trying to shoehorn it into that into that thing. I mean, you know, World War II has sort of like both helped and hurt alternate history a lot, because it's, you know, like recent, overwhelmingly important, and well, it's sort of a lazy person's way to do a villain. You have someone in an SS uniform get off a stagecoach and kick a dog, you know, so it's too easy. I haven't done much. Well, there's an analog to World War II in the Dracula books, but I haven't actually done much on World War II. I figure it's been done many times and better by a lot of really good authors. Harry Turtledove, for example. So I tend to avoid it.
That's 3 times if you count Joe Stalin.
Yeah.
3 times if you count this Joe Stalin Iron Joe book.
Yeah, Joe Steele. And yeah, actually, there was a really good cartoonist named Mark Rogers. He's dead now, unfortunately. He did the Samurai Cat books. And he had a series that was Secret History, actually, rather than alternate, in which Joseph Stalin and Adolf Hitler had a bet on who could kill the most Russians. And Stalin won, so Hitler actually had to go to work for him in the Kremlin basement.
Okay, that's about as dark as you can get.
That was gone. That was completely gone. So yes.
Of course, what brought Steve to my attention was the last book, Marching Through Georgia.
No, the last book is the Stone Dogs. Marching Through Georgia.
Stone Dogs. Stone Dogs, rather.
Which I blow up the United States. Yeah.
Yes, in which you destroy the United States. And what was the advice Jim and I gave you rather adamantly at a WindyCon and sometime in the 80s, I think?
Don't blow up the United States.
Don't annoy your major market.
Yeah, well, the thing was, everyone was expecting me to bring it to a final denouement with the bad guys destroyed and virtue triumphant, and I was just goofing on people, basically. I did it precisely the other way around. Vice is triumphant and virtue is banished to Alpha Centauri. So, by the way, that brings in another point. Always leave an out for a sequel. You know, a lot of series have been destroyed because the initial way the writer set it up didn't leave enough space. Even Patrick O'Brien, who did the Aubrey Maturin series, the historical set in the Napoleonic Wars. Some very fine writing there, by the way. It's one of my favorites.
Master and
He didn't
Commander.
anticipate how popular he was going to be, so he ran out of Napoleonic Wars and eventually had to do two year 1813s, 1813A and B, with simultaneous adventures happening on different sides of the world. It's cleverly done, and you have to be careful to notice it. But he written himself into a corner. So I try to avoid that. Even in things that I intend as a standalone, I leave a tag you can pull on to plausibly do sequels.
Yes, yes. Actually, the another Napoleonic series featuring the infantry had the same problem.
Mm-hmm.
Because,
Sharps?
Yeah, Sharps ended up in two books, one in India and one in the South American Revolution, in order to keep the series going, because they were paying them too much to stop.
Yeah, actually, that's those are very good books, and the TV series was worthy of them. The one with Sean Bean.
Except for the size of the unit, because the DVD was so cheap. How many guys? 30 guys in a company? Well,
budget constraints. I think they were using Romanians or Russians or something as the extras.
Yeah,
that's a constraint.
So the Draka was set in what period, and what was type of armament and combat was it, and why did you choose that? This is very early in your career. This is a get known book. So why did you choose what you chose? What inspired it?
I'm a student of history, military history among it, and one of the things I wanted to do was have the Ferguson rifle. It was an early breech loader invented during the American Civil War, the American Revolution. Actually fairly practical, if a little delicate, but I wanted to play with that and see what the tactical consequences would be if it was more widely used. And then I could leap ahead and do different eras of war and, warp them all a bit. Like the American Civil War in that history has steam-driven armored cars in it, which were perfectly practical. It's one of those path dependency things. Steam road vehicles were more or less suppressed by a combination of chance, paths not taken, and deliberate action by the railroads in Britain. If they'd been taken on and developed and the R&D done, they might have become more widespread much earlier. And
the railroads in Britain?
Yeah, they lobbied hard for the Red Flag Act, which restricted steam-driven road vehicles to a speed where someone could walk in front of them waving a red flag to warn people driving carriages and wagons and so forth that something that would frighten the horses was coming. And there was, of course, a massive lobby from the horse traction industry. And, everyone who was anyone had horses at the time and was devoted to the creatures. I'd never seen the charm myself. But that made it easy for them to get it through Parliament, and that more or less quashed the development of steam road coaches, which was advancing rapidly at the time.
Interesting. So you
didn't get far in the United States because the roads here weren't very good, but they were in Britain, so could have happened.
So in the Dracus series, what period is the book set in?
Mostly they're set from the analog of World War II, the Eurasian War, on through the 21st century, when, as I said, the bad guys win, and you rake me over the coals for it.
Yeah, it was one of my fonder memories. Jim Bain and I sitting on either side of you, complaining.
Mm-hmm.
Did Dave Drake inspire those? Who inspired them? Who was the inspiration for your books?
No single source, but Dave was certainly a writer I learned a great deal from. Both when I was just reading him, and then when we were collaborating later at Bain. Dave and I both do really good action scenes. Dave's are, if anything, even better. It's a standard I've been trying to attain. Dave writes completely differently. I was sort of astonished at how different we are as writers. I'm a pantser. I just have a vague idea of what I'm going to do and I dive in. Dave writes 40,000 word outlines for a 150,000 word book, which means every scene is covered. And when I was writing with him, I'd go from his outlines, and it was an oddly liberating experience because I didn't have to think about plot. It was already there and already good, and I agreed with all of it. since we have the same instincts as to what makes a story. So I could just concentrate on, writing the scene. It saves a lot of work.
Which segues into that particular and amazing series that's been repopularized several times, that both you and Eric, the godfather of Ring of Fire Con, contributed various portions of.
Yeah,
writing the Belisarius.
Yeah, it was a space opera series set on a distant planet long after the collapse of a galactic republic, and it was based on the life of Belisarius. Jim had a thing for Belisarius, and it's understandable. He's a fascinating historical character and one of the great generals. He's one of those fight outnumbered and win types. That happens occasionally, although usually you fight outnumbered and you lose. But Belisarius pulled off like miraculous stuff. And we just sort of did a bit of world building. We've got the remnant of the Galactic Federation's government on this planet that's fallen a long way. The technology is more or less mid-19th century. They ride giant dogs instead of horses, which was interesting. And actually a giant dog would be a better war mount than a horse, because horses are herbivores and their instinct is to run away from things that frighten them, and dogs not necessarily. So, and that was interesting. We more or less had him unify the world, and eventually he overthrows the analog of Justinian and puts a friend of his in place because he knows he'd be a terrible ruler himself. And yeah, that was great fun. Eric took up the torch after I sort of moved on from Bane, and I think it was the Reformer, wasn't it? And the Tyrant?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and he did a real good job too. Different from the way I'd have done it, but good. Eric and I tend to have similar ideas, but treat them rather differently. We both came up with the community marooned in time thing almost simultaneously. I think I was a little before him, but he came up with or did he come up with it in combination with Jim? I forget, didn't know the details.
He brought it to Jim.
He brought it to Jim, yeah. Well, these idea things go in cycles. One year, everyone writes a book about terraforming Mars, and we both did the community marooned in time thing. The single people marooned in time has been a science fiction staple for a long time. There's Sprite to Camps, Lest Darkness Fall, and a bunch of others. So it goes back to the Connecticut Yankee at King Arthur's Court that Mark Twain did. And, and Poul Anderson did a beautiful riff on it called The Man Who Came Early, about a guy who gets sent back to Viking era Iceland and completely pops up because he doesn't have
nothing works.
Yeah. But when you think about it, it's much more probable that a community of people sent back in the past would manage to pull things off than an individual. Because, if you get sent back to the remote past, you don't speak the language, you've got no money or the local equivalent thereof. Communities are small, closed, and usually violently xenophobic. So, you've got the deck stacked against you. If it's thousands of people, different thing altogether. I did it with the island in Nantucket, and Eric did it with a mining town in West Virginia sent to 17th century Germany. I went right back to the Bronze Age. The great thing about the Bronze Age is that outside the centers of literate civilization, not much is known. So you can make it up as long as you don't directly contradict the archaeological stuff. Though if I was doing the Island in the Sea of Time series now, I'd have to alter the dates and a bunch of other stuff because there's been a revolution in archaeology recently when they developed the ability to recover and decode ancient DNA from bodies. Put the cat among the pigeons, but I won't go into that because it'll probably bore a lot of people. I'm an obsessive nerd about that. So,
well, explain why our Bronze Age has been rewritten in a paragraph, because it is fascinating material, and a lot of us are going to, end up with stories there someday because we're running out of the rest of history.
Okay. Stones and Bones archaeology can't detect whether, if there's a change in the culture of an area, the material culture, the stuff they dig up, the pots and so forth, can't detect whether that's because the locals had a change of heart or because new people moved in. And archaeological fashion on migrations, whether it's new people or just new ideas spreading, has shifted back and forth over the past 100 years. Until recently, there was an anti-migrationist orthodoxy in archaeology folk migrations were out, invasions were out, local development was in. Then they discovered the ability to get ancient DNA from bodies, from skeletons, and completely decode it. And it turned out that this enables you to physically trace migrations. And it turned out that migrations were actually common as dirt. For example, the beaker culture shows up in England, and there's a change in settlement patterns, in pots, in weapons and burials, from communal burials to individual ones, all sorts of stuff. And the orthodoxy until recently was this was because the locals saw pots from abroad and imitated them. It actually turns out that there's a 90% genetic turnover in the British Isles within about 1 to 2 centuries when the beaker people actually arrived as a migration. The previous inhabitants were the descendants of the original farmers in Britain who were remotely descended from people from Anatolia. They spread all over Europe with the spread of agriculture. And in a century, suddenly the people are genetically different. They even look different. The original farmers were small and dark, and the people who introduced the beaker culture to Britain were tall and fair, look pretty much like Brits do now. And suddenly one population is replaced by another. Now, we don't know the mechanics of how that was done. Myself, I strongly suspect that it was not a case of them taking one look at the superior ceramic technology and all committing suicide. But, we can't say definitely, but we can say that one population succeeded another, and that turns out to be fairly common.
We have a fairly good model with the Saxons, don't we?
Yeah, they did the same thing and found out that the Anglo-Saxon invasions did result in a substantial but not complete genetic turnover in the British Isles, about 35 to 40% varying from one region to another. So oddly enough, the beaker and Anglo-Saxon migrations both came from about the same place between the mouth of the Rhine and Jutland. So that's the go-to area if you're going to invade Britain.
Yeah,
a small boat.
Okay, so this is the Islands in the Sea of Time series. Now, the fascinating part about the series is Eric's people have some internal conflict. Your series, the conflict is the center of the story, really. Internal with the transported people, whatever you want to call them, the Nantucketers. Is that what they are, Nantucketers?
Yeah, that's what Nantucketers say. Although actually, old family Nantucketers say we're from here and they're from away. I did a lot of research in Nantucket. I honeymooned on Nantucket. Jan and I honeymooned there in '88, and we go back every spring if we can to the same hotel. So I got to know the place fairly well. And when I I got the idea for the series while we were walking on the beach on Nantucket. It was at night, stars were out. I could see a ship going by the lights. And I thought, Nantucket feels isolated when you're on it, but it's really not. I wonder what it would be like. And then I got this flash of inspiration, and we turned around and I went back to the hotel room and started scribbling notes. And hence the Island in the Sea of Time series was born.
A demonstration of how patient our wives are.
Yeah. And I included Nantucket and the U.S. Coast Guard sailing ship, their training ship Eagle, which was inside the, Ring of Fire. There's a big glowing dome over Nantucket, and it's transported back to 1250 BC. I suppose the mechanism for, Eric did more background on what actually caused the transposition of Grantville back to 17th century Germany. And I threw the Eagle in because it's plausible. It's based on the mainland quite close to Nantucket and passes close to Nantucket all the time. And also because it was just, so damn useful to have a big windjammer. The Eagle was originally the Horst vessel. We got it from the Germans as war reparations after the late Great Unpleasantness. It's a fascinating ship. I was on it for a while. They taught the Island in the Sea of Time series in the literature course at the Coast Guard Academy. And the teacher, who really liked it, invited me down there, and I got to tour the ship and talk to the cadets. And they were surprised that I'd found out which paint locker cadets went to when they wanted to make out with no one knowing. But the all-powerful research mind can find out anything. And You know, even a small isolated community like Nantucket, if you throw them back that far, it's really difficult to credibly get them through the first year without all starving to death. But I managed it. I talked to the farmers on Nantucket. I researched what would grow where, and I managed to get them to do it. But that required everybody pulling together. As for the internal quarrels on Nantucket vis-a-vis those in Grantville, the circumstances are different. Once Nantucket gets going and they know they're not going to starve to death, the technological gap, and not just in physical technology, but in organizational technology, is so great that if you've got some ambitious type who thinks, gee, I'd really like to be a warlord, you know, the temptation is overwhelming, as opposed to, you know, helping hoe the potatoes back on Nantucket. I think I have a more jaundiced view of human nature than Eric does, too, as well. From the crooked timber.
None of yours were union members.
Hmm?
None of your guys were union members.
Well, my dad was for a while. He was a member of the journalist.
No, in the Island of Sea of Time series.
No, not really. A lot of them do tend to come from blue-collar backgrounds. I mean, the police chief on Nantucket, who eventually becomes CEO, is a blue-collar guy, and so's the main villain. Well, his family are small ranchers in Montana. Had a fight with Bill about, not Bill, what am I talking about? Not you, Jim, about that. He didn't like the villain being a guy from Montana. He thought the hero should be a guy from Montana. Well, can't always agree on an editor on everything with an editor.
You know, that's a good point. I suppose do you need a lot of blue collar to make something like that work? Because the image of the University of Harvard University campus being transported to the same period, how long before they starved?
Well, it depends whether the locals eat them first. Actually, I had a small group of that type of people in the Nantucket series who sail off to the first civilization in the Americas, the Olmecs in Mexico, and they're going to give them advanced technology to prevent the overrunning of the Americas. Unfortunately, the Olmecs eat them.
Yes.
And do various other unpleasant things.
Sacrifice them.
Yeah, well, you know, they're the source for Mesoamerican civilization. And if you read up on the Aztecs, Cortez did Mexico a favor. And he and the Aztecs deserved each other. So,
yeah, but the Incas did not deserve that treatment.
No, they weren't that bad. But the Aztecs, yeah, I mean, you know, one of their gods was our Lord of the Flayed, and, you know, it's really revolting. His priests used to dance around in the skins of flayed sacrificial victims. So, that's the thing about history. You could not make this stuff up.
No, you know, but then you go back to Hittite and Persian, and it's a similar tradition.
Not as bad as that, but yeah. The other thing about history is that it's full of stories and people. It's a miracle of our educational system that it makes history dull. You know, I found lots of genuine characters in history that I just would not dare to make up, like Teddy Roosevelt from my Black Chamber series, which is based on the supposition that Taft drops dead in 1912 and Roosevelt gets to be president again. You know, Theodore Roosevelt is the only vice president of the United States who leapt on a 250-pound cougar and stabbed it to death with a Bowie knife. And he's the only president who rescued a stray kitten from a dog, then walked around the White House neighborhood for 2 hours looking for a home for it, and finally found it one. So,
also the only president ever hanged a man personally.
Yep.
Sheriff in New York.
Yeah, and he's the only president who was a deputy sheriff in the Old West and captured some criminals stole his boat while he was ranching in the Dakotas. It was in the summer, in the early spring, just when the rivers were de-icing. He built a new boat, chased them down the ice-clogged river, surprised them, took them prisoner, and marched them 250 miles on foot to the sheriff's office, making them listen to his reading of Anna Karenina every night. Which is how he kept himself awake so they wouldn't be able to jump him. And he finally got there with blood leaking out of his boots, literally, and handed them over to the sheriff to be arraigned, and the sheriff looked at him and said, "Why didn't you just shoot them?"
It was so
He was a stickler for forms of law.
Is the Four Eyes story true on Teddy Roosevelt?
Yes, it is. That he had endless trouble with the glasses. People would call him Four Eyes and pick fights with him. What they didn't know was that he'd been a champion middleweight boxer at Harvard. So that generally didn't end well for the cowboy. He said as soon as he'd beaten up a man, it was fine. Everyone respected him, and the roundup could go on. They also put him on an unbroken Mustang when he first arrived there. They slipped this notorious bucker in for the horse that he'd rented. And he came out of the store, got on the horse, and it threw him at the moon. And everyone expected the dude to lie there. And he got up, dusted himself off, grabbed the horse, jumped back on. It went out of sight, bucking frantically. And an hour later, he trotted the horse back into town, tied it up, and went back into the store.
Yeah.
He had a feud with a mad French count, too, while he was ranching. There was a French count who wanted to start a meatpacking industry in the Dakota Badlands. It didn't end well. But the guy was trying to monopolize the river frontage. It was the open range era. And he was hiring killers to run people off. And he hired this notorious gunman to kill Roosevelt. And the gunman said he'd shoot him on sight. And Teddy rode up to the shack where the gunman was living and got down and stood in front of him and said, "I'm Theodore Roosevelt, and I've heard that you are going to shoot me on sight. Here I am."
Yeah.
And the guy backed down. Yeah.
You got to wonder what he's up to. And Roosevelt was always up to something. We'll go do a little more Roosevelt later. I wasn't going to go into that. I was going to chew you up for not writing sequels to Peshawar Lancers first. But
I was perfectly willing to write sequels to Peshawar Lancers. The publisher wouldn't go along with it.
To explain what that is.
The Peshawar Lancers is another alternate history I did. It's set in the 21st century, but the change point is back in Victorian times. A slew of comets hits the Earth. Basically, the Northern Hemisphere is well and truly screwed. And the British flee en masse to their colonies, South Africa, India, and Australia. And in the early 21st century, the Angrezi Raj, which is a heavily Hinduized bunch of Brits, is ruling the world from, well, not the world, about half of it, from New Delhi. And technology hasn't gone nearly as far. It was my chance to do Kipling and Talbot Mundy and Harold Lamb and all those guys. Battles in the Northwest Frontier. There are sky pirates and dirigibles. I had a hell of a, and I managed to get Flashman in as one of the hero's ancestors. I had a hell of a good time with that. And there's a bunch of mad cannibal Russians in Central Asia worshiping Chernobog or Malik Nuz. And the villain is Count Ignatieff, also a historical reference, by the way. And he has a CRS with him who can see alternate worlds, see the branching possibilities. And I had what I thought was a really good scene where she has a gunfight and she's holding the gun in both hands. She's never shot one before, but she's just scanning the alternate histories and then shooting where she knows people will be with her eyes shut. I thought that was fun. So there's sword duels on the tops of burning dirigibles and all sorts of stuff like that. It's the great game.
It sounds like you had a ton of fun with it. It's a pity.
Yeah, it was pulp to goodness.
At this point, I'm going to point out that you were born in Canada. Raised,
no, I was born in France.
Born in France, raised primarily in Canada.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of British Empire in what you do. South Africa, India. Yeah.
Well, I think the Black Chamber series is the first one that's predominantly from an American point of view. I was raised on Kipling and the Fluttering Flag and all that stuff. I went to extremely British schools for a long time, both in Kenya and in Canada. Ashbury College in Canada, which was founded as a direct imitation of your classic British public school, which is what they refer to as private schools. And I went to a school in East Africa that was run by the Honorable Colonel Massey Blumfeld, who had been a colonel in the British Army of India. This was in the 60s. He was in his 90s then, older than God. He'd actually fought on the Northwest frontier. So I got a lot of stories from him.
Oh. for anyone who's listening who wants something a little different from you, it's a different kind of alternate history, almost, the Shadow Spawn series.
That's secret history more than alternate history. That was inspired, and I've got to admit it, by Jack Williamson's Darker Than You Think. I wanted to extrapolate. So there's a secret species, a subspecies of humanity that has basically manipulates quantum probability mentally. And they ruled the humanity for a long time in the remote past, and then they were overthrown, but some of their genes remain among human beings. And in the 19th century, when genetics was first discovered, a bunch of esotericists who think they're black magicians, the Order of the Black Dawn, there's a lot of historical references there too, use their flickering powers to concentrate the genes in each generation. Their grandchildren kill them, and and have been secretly ruling the world for quite some time. They call themselves the Spawn of Shadow, or the Shadow Spawn, ruled by the Council of Shadows. And there's a brotherhood that's opposing them, and lots of secret stuff going on in the interim. I wanted to. Part of it was developing characters who had literally godlike powers and what they'd be like, and most of them would be very bad people. Because, being raised, and besides which they're natural born sadists and they drink blood. So,
yeah, well,
they secretly run the world, and that's why it's so screwed up.
Oh, good. Someone to blame.
Exactly.
I thought it was pick your political party. Really, it's them. I'm leaving. My wife and I can agree on something.
Yes, the evil magicians, evil blood drinking magicians who have screwed everything up are bad.
Then they're to blame.
Yes, and my hero is a reformed one. He drinks blood from blood banks, even though it tastes terrible. And he has an evil twin sister. So,
yeah, evidently you can make some sort of emergency blood filler out of coconut oil of some sort. I've read the Japanese and Chinese have used it, or something like that, which leads to an interesting speculation on vampires who are coconut drinkers who don't like the blood drinkers.
Yeah, well, vegan vampires. My God, they'd probably be as insufferable as ordinary vegans, but more powerful. Yeah.
They all live in Manhattan and San Francisco, so we're safe.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Let's get on to the big alternate history, alternate future, really, series in some way, your Change series, and all its versions from Sunrise Lands to Rudy's Kids and Monteval. It starts out with a premise that you only sort of explain 22 books later.
15.
Having read them just a little bitterly that it took that long. What happens that you start this alternate future history current period series?
Well, it's sort of the flip side of Island in the Sea of Time. Island in the Sea of Time sends Nantucket back to the Bronze Age. The same thing causes all higher technologies to stop functioning on Earth. It happens with a blinding flash of subjective light and a headache, and then high energy technologies simply stop working. Electronics don't work, explosives don't explode, they burn slowly. And I didn't want it to be a series about how do we find out what caused this and reverse it. That's been done to death. Actually, the people in the books are just stuck with this. They have to deal with it. They come up with 1,000 different explanations. It was super advanced aliens. It was people from the future of another dimension. God did it. The gods did it. Satan did it. But they have no proof. They just have to live with it. So it starts off in Dies the Fire. The change happens in 1998, by the way. So that does make it technically alternate history because it was already past 1998 when I wrote it. The change focuses on characters dealing with what happens. Later on, I introduced the entities that actually caused it. It starts out as post-apocalyptic because, believe me, if all higher technologies stopped working, the results would be apocalyptic.
And what happens in the apocalypse, which we all love to hear about?
Most people die. Obviously, if you're in New York or Greater LA, or Tokyo or Shanghai or whatever, you're just totally screwed. A few people survive from places like that, but it requires like winning 14 lottery tickets at the same time. And then there's a penumbra of less and less immediately disastrous until you get out to the places where if everything goes right and everyone makes the right decisions, they can pull through. So you get...
I believe starvation is your big killer?
Well, starvation in Southern California.
Like cannibalism.
It's thirst in Southern California. The water stops coming out of the taps. You can survive not having food for a couple of weeks, especially if you've got some extra padding. But you can't survive without water for more than a few days. So, yeah. Then there are like catastrophic fires and all sorts of other disasters. Pile disaster on disaster. The places that survive tend to be isolated or can be deliberately isolated. Islands, remote places. It's luck of the draw and qualities of leadership. One of the characters says in Dies the Fire, when the going gets weird, the weird get going. People who can mentally assimilate that this is A, happened, it's B, happened everywhere, and C, it's not going to stop, have a massive advantage over everybody else. The ones who just sit and wait for the National Guard to arrive don't have a good prognosis. Ditto the ones who think, well, we just have to get through a few weeks until everything returns to normal. Not a good prognosis. So the survivors, sorry.
One particular group you picked there, Steve, that had the right skills to survive and excel in that environment after it settled down. Do you remember?
Oh, yeah. A mad well, sort of very eccentric, shall we say, SCA type, takes over large chunks of Oregon and Washington and sets up a feudal kingdom. His name is Norman Arminger, and he's obsessed with the Norman kingdoms in early medieval Europe. So he gets his friends together. He was also he was a professor, and he was doing a study project on the gangs of the Pacific Northwest, and he recruits a lot of them too. And they set up this feudal kingdom in Oregon and Washington. The Portland Protective Association is what it's called, and he's the Lord Protector. A nasty piece of work, but very smart, and his wife's even smarter than this. She lives a lot longer too. Then I have a Wiccan group who turn into a pseudo-Celtic clan, rather to the disgust of their clan chief, Juniper Mackenzie, who's a folk singer and actually does speak Gaelic. And then there's the guy who lucked out, Michael Havel, who's a bush pilot in Idaho, former Marine recon, and he's flying over the Bitterroot Mountains in a small plane with a group of people he's flying to their ranch when the change hits. And of course, the engines conk out, and he manages to pancake them on a small lake, and eventually ends up as running a group in Oregon too. And the faculty senate of Corvallis manages to pull Corvallis through by a series of miracles, but later on become notorious for sitting in circles talking and never doing anything.
I noticed you also took advantage of this to restore royalty to control of Britain.
Yeah, sort of. The SAS get Queen Elizabeth and her family out to the Isle of Wight, which is the islands around Britain. Some of them survive. Britain itself, total meltdown, too densely populated, too small. But the Isle of Wight survives. I looked into that, and the Isle of Wight would be a good candidate to survive if it could cordon itself off, because they grow enough food for the population. So a very small, as in a couple of 100,000 people, Britain survives the first year, takes over mainland Britain again. And Prince Charles is crucial to this, because as it turns out, Prince Charles actually has a set of skills that would be very useful. He's a fanatical organic farmer, for example. He's got a big organic estate at Highgate. And yeah, his general orientation is like flaky in the extreme in the modern world, but suits the changed world to a T. Although eventually he does go completely crazy, and his mad Icelandic queen tries to take over. There's a counter coup, and Prince William becomes King of Greater Britain. And Britain becomes a sort of medieval Victorian Edwardian 1940s mishmash, which was sort of like profoundly personally satisfying to me. So I just had a lot of fun with that part of it. And Sir Nigel Loring eventually ends up in Oregon and becomes an important character, marries Juniper Mackenzie. I took those characters from a series of historical novels written by Conan Doyle, you know, the Sherlock Holmes guy. He actually preferred his historical novels and was bewildered that they weren't more popular. And it's an alternate history in the change world. And one of the alternate parts is that the Conan Doyle historicals are actually factual. So these are the descendants of some of the descendants of the people in those books. That's the thing about writing. You can be God and do all sorts of good stuff. Modesty Blaise is real in that history too. Although she's only mentioned off stage.
Yes. Technology that they end up developing is interesting to deal with the situation, both in warfare and out of it. The catapults impress me.
Yeah, well, the thing is, you may take away the technology, but you don't take away the materials or the engineering skills. Like, you can make a really good crossbow with automobile leafings and a pump and an efficient pump action that lets you fire it fairly quickly. Trebuchets made out of steel with modern engineering to calculate the stresses and leverage and stuff. Hydraulic piston-cocked ballista and stuff like that. You know, you have to go back to like pre-gunpowder weapons, but they're better pre-gunpowder weapons. Same thing with armor. One of my heroines in the later books has a set of titanium alloy plate armor, which is like much better than the original. And all sorts of stuff like that.
We're running towards the end of this session, and you've had a long career. You've been very successful in several series, et cetera. I have questions from potential viewers, et cetera. Of course, the first question is, of course, what's the secret of writing a bestseller?
If you find out, tell me.
Yeah, we'd love to know. I believe the best response I ever got was from Dave Weber, who said, sell a lot of books.
Yeah. You write the book. I write the books that I want, that I would like to read. And if people buy them, that's serendipity. I've never known exactly. You can't write to market. People try all the time, and it rarely works. Just write the book you want.
If you were to give some advice to someone who is writing their alternate history for the Ring of Fire universe, for their own universe, or anything else, what's the good things to do with they should watch out for alternate history, or what should they not do wrong?
Don't let the wish fulfillment get completely out of control. Alternate history is the ultimate non-falsifiable hypothesis. You can't prove a damn thing one way or another. I try to go by credibility. If I'm writing hard alternate history, like no alien space bats or gods involved, I try to do things that I think are credible given my knowledge of the history in question. It's technically possible that everyone in Europe in 1914 would suddenly decide to become a Theravada Buddhist, but I don't find that credible. On the other hand, it's extremely credible that Gavrilo Princip doesn't get to kill Franz Ferdinand because that was a comedy of errors. There's a substantial school of thought that the people in Serbia who backed the assassins intended them to fail because, their poison pills were out of date and didn't work. Every one of them was some sort of screw up or klutz. One of them tried to kill himself by jumping into a river that turned out to be 2 feet deep. Gavrilo Princip gave up after the initial bomb attack failed and went to have lunch. And he came out of the place, he was out of the cafe, and Franz Ferdinand's car had taken a wrong turning, stalled, and was trying to back up, and it was right there in front of him. History is full of things that are grossly improbable. But that doesn't give you a license to do anything you want, in my opinion, unless it's a joke. You're doing it as humor. But like World War I could have not happened, or happened differently, or happened earlier, or happened later. But as I said, everyone in Europe was not going to become a Theravada Buddhist. That would require cultural developments happening over many generations. Politics and war, that's different. Small groups of people make decisions, and they could have decided something else. And small groups of people, including people like Kaiser Wilhelm, who's a complete blowhard, who always chickened out at the last minute. So after he'd given the initial orders, the German general staff deliberately isolated him and censored his telegrams so he wouldn't change his mind at the last minute. And he nearly did anyway.
Right.
Yeah, but you know, about 20 people made the decisions that led to World War I. All of them except one had fun in front of their names, and the only exception was Count Tisza in Hungary, and he was only an exception because Magyars don't use von. Right. So, you know, 20 people made that decision. Billions were affected, but 20 people made the decision. And that sort of thing can go either way. But broader stuff, like when inventions are made and so forth, that's a lot less flexible. Like Romans could not have invented internal combustion engines. They probably couldn't have invented steam engines, even though Greeks had done some experiments with aerofoils and stuff like that, because they didn't have a concept of atmospheric pressure. When the steam engine was invented in Europe, it was the result of 150 years of experiments with vacuum and atmospheric pressure. Then people decided to apply it to useful stuff, but the knowledge came first. So on the other hand, someone in the Bronze Age could easily have invented stirrups. That just didn't happen. And it could have happened, and it would have had big consequences. Yeah. That's just wooden leather.
Think of them steppe barbarians with stirrups.
Yeah, well, they're the ones who invented it. Nomads on the northern border of China probably invented the stirrup.
I know, but what if 1,000 years earlier or 2,000 years earlier would have been interesting.
Yeah, exactly, because it drastically increased the effectiveness of anything you did while riding a horse.
We'd be showing off our yurts right now.
Actually, the Mongols call them gurs.
Well, thank
I found that out too. I've got in the Change series, there's a Mongol exchange student studying in South Dakota at the time of the change, and he's friends with a couple of Lakota, and the Lakota end up doing fairly well out of the change, but he tells them a lot of stuff his folks did, and one of the things is gurs, yurts. And so the Lakota of the change universe only use teepees for ceremonial purposes because they're like terrible for winter. As winter dwellings. They use gurs for living in instead, and those are actually extremely practical.
Right. I'm afraid we have run over, in fact. If someone wants to look at your books and look at you and your work, where should they go to find you?
Well, that depends whether they want a series or a standalone. If they want a standalone, I'd say Peshawar Lancers or Conquistador. If you want to start a series, Dies the Fire for the Change series, Island in the Sea of Time, that's a trilogy, or Black Chamber. That's the one I got the 2019 Dragon Award for Best Alternate History, and I think it's my best work so far. But you always think the stuff you're working on now is your best work if you're really putting your heart into it.
And all of them can be found on your list at S.M.Stirling.com.
Yes, they can, and they're also all on Amazon.
So
I have an Amazon page.
Thank you very much. We appreciate the chance to speak, and we'll look forward to seeing you on some of our panels.
Okay, looking forward to it too.
Thank you all.